From time to time you may need to remove the trigger from inside the frame. The trigger assembly is held in place by this blue item here in the top of the frame called the bearing carrier. Blue item actually carries the two bearings that the trigger rocks on, and it also carries this silver strip here, which is the spring return of the trigger. Underneath here you'll also find the magnet for the magnetic return part of the trigger. All of this assembly is held in place with these two screws. So in order to remove the trigger, first need to remove these screws. You'll need to hold the power lines, which are the positive and negative lines here from the battery pack. Hold those to the side while you remove the screws and the trigger. Take out both of those retaining screws. Grab the trigger from underneath and gently and carefully lift the full assembly out of the frame. At this point, if you're removing the trigger because you received a hit inside here, or there's paint or dirt, debris, mud, grease, whatever inside the trigger, then now is a good time to clean the slot inside here. I generally use something like a Q-tip or an earbud and wipe around the inside of here, make sure it's as clean as possible, which reduces friction on the trigger and also stops any fault sensing from either the micro switch or the opto switch. Once you have taken the trigger assembly out of the frame, you'll see it comes in several parts. This is the spring, this is the trigger return spring, and as mentioned before, underneath here we have the return magnet. That works by attracting one of the screws here up towards the magnet, and the tension of that can be adjusted by adjusting the tensioning screw underneath to give it a stronger or a weaker magnetic attraction. And unlike previous trigger assemblies, this one is a two-piece assembly. Simply remove the screw from the back, which is the same size screw as the two retaining screws, and the trigger shoe now comes off. If you want to change or swap trigger, or simply just clean in more detail inside, and that is how you remove that. Reattach it, just hold the two pieces together, drop in the mounting screw and screw that back into place, making sure it's as tight as possible. You don't want that coming loose during a game. In order to remove the trigger from the bearing carrier, you simply use a 1/16 key to slacken off the screw in the back of here. This clamps the trigger onto the trigger pin, which goes through the two bearings here. Slacken off that, push the pin out, and then the bearing carrier and the trigger plate can be separated. When reassembling it, make sure that the trigger pin doesn't stick out on either side of the bearing carrier, as that can cause interference with the inside of the frame and cause sticky trigger. So make sure that it's nice and flush on both sides before reassembling. Before reassembling, reattach the trigger return spring. Trigger return spring can be adjusted in strength by using the top screw in the trigger here through the face of the trigger, and that acts on the trigger return spring at the back here. It allows you to increase or decrease the tension of the spring. Can be fiddly to reassemble this when the wires are in place and the circuit board is in place. What's very important is that you don't catch any part of the trigger on the micro switch inside the frame. And just allow that to gently sit itself down, pull the wires out of the way if need be, and you can see that by placing your finger on the top and just holding it all in place, that the trigger does work. You can hear it clicking on the micro switch, and it's not binding on anything inside the frame. The two retaining screws can now be placed back into the frame and the bearing carrier, clamping everything back into place. Once that's been done, simply reattach the frame to the body of your marker. If you're struggling to get the trigger assembly back inside the frame, it may be easier just to open up one side of the grips and allow access to both the micro and opto switch attached to the circuit board. This will allow you to more easily guide the trigger assembly down inside the frame, making sure that you're not catching either the opto or the micro with either of the components on the back of the trigger assembly. That can just be fastened back up again afterwards once your trigger assembly is back in place.